Well, hello again. My name is Dr. Albert LaChance, and we're recording here the 12 Foundations of Unitive Psychology. And it's important to recall that my bringing the psychological content directly into the Teilhardian vision causes me to remind people from time to time that this is an extension of the work of Thomas Berry, which itself was an extension of the work of Teilhard de Chardin. So in Teilhard, we're given the fundamental new vision of the universe in its sacredness from pre-existence up to the moment we're talking in. Thomas Berry then, a cultural historian, brings in how that plays out in all of the world cultures and in ecology. He begins that journey into spiritual ecology. And what I was asked to do by him, and which made sense anyway, given the fact that this big piece was missing in the overall tradition, was to bring psychology into the mix, or into the extension of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's thinking. And the particular kind of ecology it turns out to be is an eco-psychology. It's a cosmopsychology, a geopsychology, a biopsychology, and an overall eco-psychology. And so, again, you might have noticed we're in a new environment than the ones we've done so far if you're following this. That we will probably use for the last 5 of these, this one and the 4 to follow, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So this one here is about the preeminent importance of the genetic code. Thomas Berry one time in our sessions together in New York, he said that if there is a word of God, if there really is God's language in the created order, the first place we should look for it is in the genetic code. That the entire unfolding, and he called the unfolding of the universe the first holy book. And the holy book is written in the alphabet of life itself, which is DNA. So playing from that point on, after my talks with him and encouraged by him to do this, I came up with a nuanced version of his 12 principles, which includes the psychological vision. So foundation number 8 reads this way: the genetic code, or biologos, can be thought of as the alphabet of life. It has at least 4 dynamic levels of functioning. The first of these can be called propagation, the second, ecological governance, the third, human culture, and the fourth, the unitive. This 4th level must both transcend as well as include the whole biosphere in its collective and self-reflexive consciousness. The viability of the genetic code throughout the biosphere is of paramount importance to unitive psychology, or to any practitioner using this psychology. So, the first of these levels has to be the dealing with deep propagation. And I've actually, on this next page, attached a definition from Merriam-Webster's dictionaries that goes like this: propagate, number 1, to cause a plant or animal to reproduce itself or to raise a breed of such plants or animals. Number 2, to reproduce itself, to multiply. It would be said of a plant or an animal, their multiplication is their propagation. Number 3, to transmit hereditary characteristics by reproduction, by way of reproduction. And the 4th, to spread ideas, customs, from person to person or generation to generation. That's the cultural level. And we'll do these one at a time, but that's level 3, and it is of crucial importance. And so I'm going to read it a second time. To spread ideas, customs, etc., from person to person, generation to generation. Number 5, to extend or transmit through space as to propagate light. So there's a whole lot to be said in just the definition in your common Merriam-Webster dictionaries, like the one right here, where I took the picture of this from. So looking at them then, one at a time, and I'm going to introduce the whole idea a little bit deeper. There are 26 letters to our alphabet. The recombination of these 26 letters provide us with all our literature, our scripture, our constitutions, our medical and legal documents, all psychology, and on goes the list. Anything that is to be perpetrated in order to be spoken of person to person, teacher to student, generation to generation, all of it, every bit of it, is the recombination of sounds, agreed upon sounds, that are put together through these 26 letters and just recombining them. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And then there are other alphabets. The Russian alphabet and Chinese and Japanese and on it goes. There's an entirely different number of them, and they too are all grounded and propagated by the genetic code. It is truly miraculous to think about. 26 letters. So, even more amazing than that, if it's possible, even more amazing than that is the recombination of the 4 letters of the genetic code. 4. A, adenine, G, guanine, C, cytosine, and T, thymine. Provide us with that 26-letter alphabet, along with the whole of biological evolution, from the unicellular level to the language of quantum physics, mathematics mathematics can only be described by those by the phonetic letters, but all of mathematics also arises out of those 4 letters of the genetic alphabet, the recombination of them. All existence and functioning of every life form that was, is, and ever shall be, all of them, every single one of them, individually, billions of species, probably trillions over the whole expanse of the evolutionary story, all of them from 4 letters. It's pretty astounding. And so in Foundation 8, I'm going to introduce the functioning of this understanding of these 4 letters. Propagation, of these 4 dynamics. Propagation, governance, culture as a whole, and unitive psychology, unitive spirituality. Now, even before we start, and I'll probably repeat this into the talk, even before we start, when you think of what I just said, 26 letters for everything written in the phonetic alphabet, all of that arising out of 4 letters, plus the entire functioning of the whole life community from the get-go to this moment, including the organism that is speaking to you now and the organism to which I'm speaking. All of it, every single individual, every species, every culture, everything that lives, has lived, or will live, runs on this 4-letter alphabet. So when we hear people trivializing the changes going on in the planet, and especially in the biosphere, when we hear them giving us comforting lies that there's no danger and nothing to worry about, we'd better think again. We'd better think again and ask ourselves, why are we taking comfort in clear and obvious lies? Because this is our genetic code. This is the code that's passed to our children. And it's all very delicate. It's very delicate and at the same time, very robust and strong. But when we start looking at the 4 dynamics, the first being propagation, we need to begin to think what it means for us to be spewing our poisonous, carcinogenic ingredients all over the habitat in which this genetic propagation is going on. We've only known about the genes since 1953, Watson and Crick. And yet we're confident that tossing anything anywhere, that there is such a thing as a way. There's no such thing as a way. This is one community of life. And so everything we spit into the air, everything we spit into the water, everything we spit into the soil actually winds up going through our bodies, through our eggs and semen, and is then the toss-up, the flipping of the coin, as to whether that works together with the toxins present in order to bring forth a healthy child. I wonder at times, as a doctor of psychology, I wonder about, situations like autism. What is that? It seems to me to almost be the unwillingness to be born fully, the unwillingness to a kind of resistance within the species. Now, I can't give you any research on that. I can't give you anything to read on that. It's just a gut feeling when you've been in the world of psycheology, the way of the soul, which has become mindology. When you're in that world long enough, you start really seeing what the DSM-4 has in its eloquence, but also what's missing. You begin to notice that there is some pretty big missing language there in the diagnostic and statistical manual. So unitive psychology is an attempt to make up for some of that. It's an attempt to fill in some of those cracks and some of those missing pieces. And so in the preceding foundation, which was foundation number 7, we dealt with the nature of permeability. And in that foundation, we established that all things flow into all things, whether air, water, soil, or life itself. So in Foundation 8, we can begin to imagine what that means regarding pollution, let alone nuclear waste pouring out of Japan. It's already arrived on the West Coast. The publisher of my books, the owner of the publishing house, North Atlantic Books, told me during a conversation that the reason he moved from Berkeley to Maine was because the radiation is already showing up in the water on the West Coast. It's all one thing, especially the ocean, especially the ocean and the atmosphere, it's pretty clear that there are no ultimate boundaries that protect ourselves from what's flowing toward us that way. And when I say flowing toward us, I also mean that we put it there. The human put it there. So Earth and its life community, the biosphere, has no ultimate barrier to anything present and presently on Earth. Pollution of soil will ultimately pollute water. Pollution of air will ultimately pollute both soil and water. And because we eat from the soils, drink the water, and breathe the air, think of pouring, here's a way to think about it. Think of pouring ink into a sponge and then eating the sponge. Better yet, imagine feeding that sponge to your children. Like, dinner's ready. That's what it's like. Everything is permeable, so everything absorbs and flows. And it's troubling to think about these things, but it's the truth. It's much more comforting to hear some bozo. I saw a wonderful bumper sticker recently, and it said, elect a clown, you expect a circus. Elect a clown and expect a circus. Well, a circus in the natural world is nothing to laugh about or to trivialize or to deny. It's not to be denied. And when I was studying with Thomas Berry, he actually, this was I started with him in 1984, and we went through to 1990. And he told me at that time, he said, we've got about 30 years until the pollution forces us into a political decision about it. And it's hard to imagine what it was like prior to that. I mean, talking about any of this stuff could get you laughed right off a stage, and it did with him. But he said about 30 years. Well, let's say 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020. Look around. People think that's prophecy, like, oh, he foretold the future. No, he didn't. He read the present properly. And when you read the present properly and you delete the functions of denial and outright lie, you wind up knowing the truth. And then that truth plays out because it's predictable, diagnosable, and inevitable. Unless we change and change dramatically. My own words come back to me in step 1 of cultural addiction. I wrote a book for Thomas Berry. It served as a kind of thesis for our time together. And it's been published 3 times, twice as Green Spirit and once as Cultural Addiction. And it's a 12-step program that is meant to do something about this, because 12-step function. He asked me to write a cultural therapy. And I think I've said this before earlier on. I asked him, what's a cultural therapy? And he said, I don't know, there's never been one. And I just looked at him and I said, oh. On the way home, I was listening to Beethoven's 6th Symphony, the Pastoral, and it dawned on me. If I took Thomas Berry's 12 principles and wed them to the 12 steps that emerged out of Alcoholics Anonymous, then suddenly we would have a 12-step program that offends no one's theologies and provides the opportunity to begin to heal the mess we're in. 12-step programs work. So I did, and so here's how step 1 read. We admitted that we were powerless over an addicted culture, that our lives and all of life has been degraded. And that was written in the very late 80s. It was published in 1990 the first time. And it had a brief life. I heard from California, I heard from New York, I heard from several places. And then, it wasn't good news, it wasn't denial, and it wasn't lies, it was the truth. And it served as a kind of thesis for my time with him. And so he wrote the introduction to it. And the name now is Cultural Addiction. That's the name of it. So if we elect a fool, and he appoints a fool like Pruitt, and a liar, to preside over the willful destruction of the biosphere, who are then the real fools? Elect a pathogen and expect a plague. So, it was then that I decided to go to Webster and see what his statements were. And I read them to you, and I'll go on. We'll do that again with another word, I believe. So the second of the functions of these dynamics, right, propagation, the second one is the governance that comes out as a result of the interplay between the genetic codes. And in his principles, he talks about the real wonder is the interaction between the codes themselves. So if you can imagine this, if you can imagine something, maybe the size of a kitchen table or whatever, and think of that as the biosphere. And imagine a billion species. And their ability to function, to propagate, interlocks between all of them and creates a government which is invisible. Like all government is ultimately invisible. The words tell us what it means. And in this case, the genetic code finds a way for all of these species to interact. And we call that the biosphere, the sphere of life. And that governance is invisible. Now imagine somebody coming in with battery acid and spraying it with one of those sprays that we use for our dishwashers or whatever, right? And imagine it being poured all over the visible dimension of the life forms. And in doing so, the invisible connection between them, the government of the whole process, melts. And then somebody comes along and says, vote for me because none of this is happening. So the second of these is called the governance. In this case, Mr. Webster provides 5 applicable definitions of the word govern. 1, to exercise authority over, to direct, to control, to rule, and to manage. This is self-government. Number 2, to influence the action or conduct of. Number 3, to restrain, to hold in check, to curb. Number 4, to regulate the speed of. And number 5, to determine, to be a rule or law for, as an example he gives, the scientific principles governing a phenomenon. So in Thomas Berry's system, he talks about at all levels of the created order. And what does he mean? He means an intergovernmental relationship between subatomic particles, actually quanta. Then subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, megamolecules, cells, organ systems, organisms, bioregion, habitat, bioregion, continent, planet, solar system, galaxy, universe. At all of those levels, the governance is invisible. Just think of gravity, right? I drop a pen here, boom. It's the same everywhere. You see the pen fall, but you don't see gravity. Gravity is the force that made it happen. There are 4 major forces in the universe: gravitational, electromagnetism, the strong and the weak nuclear force, which govern the holding, the creativity of the atom, and its disintegration, which is radioactivity. To get that level of complexity, all governed invisibly, we don't see it. We see its effect on every level, but we don't see it because it's invisible. So, since the beginning of life on Earth, there have been billions upon billions of species emergent from the greater life of the planet. Each of them, as we have seen, is engendered by DNA. We've called that propagation when we consider that all of them has some place within the larger truth of the whole life community, or the biosphere, and each of them provides checks and balances, which is the wisdom that we see present in our own Constitution, that it just emerges, it's invisible. It emerged invisibly in the Founding Fathers. They understood who we really are as a species, that we run on a lot of primate law. Primates is what we are in the visible dimension. Gods are what we are in the invisible. So they provide checks and balances among them all so that too much propagation is checked by predation. So if you have too many prey species, the predators will reduce them. And if they don't reduce them, then what happens is the habitat gets destroyed both for prey and for predator. And that's what you see in the knowledge we now have about the buffalo and the wolf, or any of the African mammals and the wolves and lions and other predators, is that they prune the herd. And because they prune the herd, there's greater life, greater health, greater everything within the herd. But if the herd gets too small, then what happens is the predator species starve or move on. So there is this wonderful breathing of propagation, predation, propagation, predation, until we come along. And then things change. So all the green plants, for instance, take in CO2 and emit O2, oxygen, while reptiles, birds, and mammals take in O2 and breathe out CO2. So again, there's that breathing of life. I used to, in my earlier books, I used to call it the kiss of life, that we give off, by breathing with our mouths, we give off CO2, and by breathing from their mouths, they give, the green plants give us O2. And so everybody's breathing back and forth. There's this wonderful, once again, rhythm. The in-breath, the out-breath, and the mutuality of it, until too many trees and green plants are cut down, or too many humans cut down too many trees and green plants. And then all of a sudden, that's that rhythm of control and expansion gets complex and goes into trauma. the baffling complexity somehow balances itself. That balance and all others work together to, using Webster's words, exercise authority, to direct, to control, to rule, to manage the whole life of Gaia, the biosphere of the blue planet, the blue jewel of a planet. The laws of Gaia influence the action or conduct of the billions upon billions of organisms making up the whole. These influences restrain, hold in check, and curb the action of any and all species. The speed of expansion and contraction of species and habitat are held in check. These are all words from Merriam-Webster that I'm using in my sentences, the verbs. Held in check. These determinations become rules for laws and for scientific principles that govern all phenomena upon Earth. The complexity of the balance is mind-blowing. Brian Swim once said to me, quote, "Take Rembrandt and gouge out one of his eyes and part of his brain, and you'll still get Rembrandt paintings, but of a vastly different quality." And that's what I meant in step one. That's what I was trying to capture. That our lives and all of life have been degraded. We've carved out the eyeball. We've carved out part of the frontal lobe of Gaia. And to listen to anyone telling you that that's not true is ultimately to sign our collective death warrant. And once again, we're fingering the gun of suicide. We're playing these games with North Korea, and Putin and Trump are playing their little game. And, you know, we thought this was over after the Cold War. And when you think about it collectively or biospherically, it really is cultures asking themselves, are we viable enough or should we commit suicide? And Gorbachev and Reagan seemed, especially under the influence of Pope John Paul II, seemed to make the decision to not do that. No, we're not going to commit suicide. So where do we go from here? And they started disarming. What did we do in 2016? Why would we be comfortable doing collective suicide 2.0? Why? It's not my question. It's our question. Advertisers continue to sell us the prescription for a man-made paradise. In fact, it's a pathological paradise. They sell, and we buy, and we buy, and we buy. And it'll end with bye-bye. That's how it ends. We're driving this whole thing. It's like getting into your car in the morning and going to look for your car. We've got to realize that we're driving this. In this great country, in this unbelievable idea called democracy, all we have to do is wake up and realize we're driving the car. We don't have to go look for it. There's nowhere to look. We are it. We're the invisible dimension of the governance of the North American continent and the United States embedded in it. The United States is invisible. The North American continent is its visible component. So, the very planet is paradise, and we seek the Garden of Eden as we expel ourselves from it by destroying it. We've got that deep spiritual yearning for a return to paradise. And yet by what we're doing, we expel ourselves from it. All the indications tell us, those who are willing to read and actually admit the truth of what they read, they all tell us, they're all indicators telling us that we're about to lose paradise a second time. Wherever Mr. Milton is, I hope he hears that. Elect a clown and expect a circus. And a scary clown at that. The planet as a whole governs the species as a whole. We cannot buy or bomb our way to paradise. When we destroy the community, we destroy the laws that govern it. They are all intrinsic. We can think of it this way. The structure of the snowflake is intrinsic to each one. Raise the temperature and the snowflake melts. Where did the structure go? We see that they're structured looking at them under a microscope. They're highly structured, profoundly beautiful lace. Raise the temperature and they melt. Where'd the structure go? The structure was intrinsic, invisible, temperature dependent. So what it comes down to is the biosphere is melting. And we hear about it daily. You know, at both poles, things are falling apart. The structure that are the glaciers and other frozen structures, they're the structures of the planet. And as they melt, up comes the ocean to wash away the problem. So the third dynamic then is the emergence of human culture as a whole, the whole of human culture. Since the beginning, the universe has been striving for consciousness of itself. And I'm going to try to slow down a minute to explain what that means. The universe gropes, in a sense. If we want, we call it the Tao, we can call it Logos, we can call it Brahman, we can call it Wakantanka, it doesn't matter. The universe is groping in culture to find a way to see itself, to understand itself. And that is who we are. We are that species in which the universe achieves self-reflexive consciousness, consciousness of itself. So we're the watchdogs. We're actually the watchdogs for life on earth. So when scriptures like the beginning of Genesis are translated that would get to give us dominance, it's not dominance. It's the ability to understand and provide care for. And there are so many different translations of that word. But I like Thomas Berry's and Teilhard's the best, that the universe is striving to be able to see itself. And that means that once we see it, I think of it as a periscope sticking out of the ocean. The periscope pops up, that's us, looks around, right? It understands what's going on, and then continues its journey. We are the periscope of the planet. That's our function. So that those who are telling us it doesn't matter, the planet's had worse than this happened to it before, sure, it probably has, but we're not dinosaurs. Although we're certainly trying to turn ourselves into a dinosaur species. So the universe has been striving for consciousness of itself. The community of human cultures is that consciousness. It's not about pieties, it's not about being right, it's not about any of that. No one culture can make the claim of absolute and total consciousness at this point. Why? Because we are no longer limited in our ability to communicate. The cultures were separated by natural structures of the planet. They are no longer. I can reach right into my pocket, right now, and I can call Vietnam and talk to somebody like that. So we're also recognizing our global interdependence economically. All of this oneness is presenting itself to us, and yet still we're beating each other into Hamburg over the name of God or our peculiar little theologies and all of that. It's not that one is right and one is wrong, is that they're all right. They're all right. They all have a voice in the genetic production of human culture as a whole. In other words, in the ability to see and understand itself. It's not as though, as I said, one is right and one is wrong. It's not that. We do that to each other. We do that to each other, but rather that they're all true, and each has a different vocabulary as to how to express that truth. Interreligious dialogue is really pretty nonsensical. What's really needed is the recognition that they all have the same goal, which is to awaken the human to a unitive understanding of its relationship to the other species, to the other cultures, so on and so forth. It's not that we're trying to make one this and one that, or even build timid little bridges between them. It's a simple recognition that they all have consciousness as their goal, and that consciousness is one consciousness. They're all attempting to express truth. Pre-existent consciousness expressed itself and shaped that expression, that pressing outward from itself, from its own core, in the stories, rituals, and behaviors in all of the different tribal peoples of all continents. As so many feminist mythologists have made clear, these tribal cultures are matrilinear and more than often matrifocal. As Professor Daniel M. Cobb has made clear in his lectures on the Great Book, not the Great Books, the Great Courses, that the successive assault on North and South American cultures, especially by the Spanish had special cruelty involved in it all, but also by the other Euro-patriarchal cultures, turned what might have been the great cultural wedding of matrifocal native traditions to patrifocal Euro traditions. They turned it instead into the great rape. What could have been the great wedding became the great rape. We have not come close to recovering from that rape. And because it is precisely the earth-centered religions we refuse to receive, and lacking that gift, we continue to devastate those cultures, and in so doing, we destroy the echo laws that govern the whole life community. We have even renewed the consideration of incinerating paradise, as I said, in nuclear exchange. Columbus did not discover the Americas. The Americas discovered Columbus. Columbus Day is the day we recall the great rape. It should be a day of mourning. All the succeeding avatars, beginning with the friendships, of Melchizedek and Abraham, recorded in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, and in Psalm number 110, and in Paul's letters to the Hebrew, chapter 7, Paul's letter to the Hebrew, and in C.S. Lewis's contemplation of his books, Meditations on the Psalms, page 122 to 124, talks about Melchizedek. And that's another story, but I just wanted to begin introducing the name Melchizedek. Which led to the avatars beginning with the friendship of Melchizedek and Abraham, Moses, Noah, and right on down to Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan, both of them Jews, both of them Hebrew prophets. Whether they like the name or not, I don't blame them. The P word is a very uncomfortable word to have focused on you, because we know where the prophets end up typically. That they've given us guidance on how to live a life more consistent with the evolutionary truth of human life. Yeshua, Mohammed, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Mencius, Krishna, Gautama Buddha, and 1,000 others have given us the recipe for peace and for life. Presidents Kennedy, Carter, and Obama have attempted to enshrine cultural wisdom into policy. We prefer the Newt Gingrich, Donald Trump formula of hatred, cultural superiority, and other violations of life itself. So instead of fostering truth, we continue to amputate the evolutionary process of making the planet great to egomaniacal attempts to replace decency with maliciousness and violation. Therefore, we must return consciously to a mode of existence that will enable evolution to resume. The evolution of culture will allow the evolution of the earth, of all of Earth life, to resume. So as we come to the end of this, what of the fourth level? What's the fourth level? Because that's the point of all of this. We have propagation, governance, human culture. So what's number 4? The fourth level of the genetic code is the unitive level. If we are given the time we need before the great collapse takes place, it needs to be named, the great collapse takes place, we must transcend and include the whole biosphere in our collective cultural self-reflection. We cannot do it unless all of the cultures are present, respecting each other, and creating a database of collective cultural wisdom. That is what we need. And it needs to begin with the native peoples, because they were the first to be embedded, to be truly embedded in the various continents that we now recognize as struggling. This very transcendence must be uncovered in our global culture and moral database. We need a unitive psychology and the resultant third covenant in order to get the train of Western cultural evolution back on the tracks. Does the world of the human look like a global train wreck to you? Does it? Think about the news. Does the world of the human look not unlike a train wreck? An avatar I've not yet mentioned in this 8th foundation is a man I like to call, and not comically, I don't do this for a quick chuckle, William of Vermont. And I'm not going to attach saint to it because that makes it comical. But William of Vermont. He was the founder in the 1930s, while Europe was founding fascism, Nazism. He was the founder of the Way of the 12 Steps, which I'm trying now to embed the language, the very statement, the Way of the 12 Steps, to say that this is a legitimate cultural movement. It is global, and it's only been around for less than 100 years. And it was founded by William of Vermont. In step 3 of the 12, we read, made a decision to turn our lives and our wills over to the care of God as we understand God, underlined. Actually in the book, as we understand God. In step 11, it is written, continued through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact. Well, that's that the universe is trying to achieve self-reflexive knowledge of itself. So if we maintain cultural conscious contact, that's what's going on. That's what's evolving. So if we improve, to improve our conscious contact with God as we understand God, praying only for knowledge of His or her will for us, and the power to carry that out. This is the prophetic way into the future. This is how it's done. And there's no theology attached. God is not the name for anyone's God. God is a collective term like the sacred or the divine. It's not the name of anyone's God. It's just a collective word. The Trump-Pence administration is a recipe for disaster. He's always calling everything, it's a disaster. Well, if you want to see the real disaster, take a good look at what's going on and be honest about it. It's a recipe for disaster, and we are actually in the midst of that disaster. Madeleine Albright, in her book, Fascism, A Warning, has forced me into stop saying we're heading toward fascism and that we're actually in it. Fascism is not a kind of government. It's not German National Socialism. It's not National Socialism in Italy. It's none of that. What it is in any government, hatred expressed as policy is what it is. And it's important to remember that both Hitler as well as Mussolini were elected. They were elected. This was not a coup d'etat. They were both elected legally. God is not the name of any God in any system. So, we have in the 12 steps a loaves and fishes. Those of you who are familiar with the story in the Bible, in the New Testament, rather. It's a sort of methodology starting with William of Vermont and his friend Bob Smith, a doctor, that has in less than 100 years drawn millions from the underworld of inebriation into the light of recovery. Because there is no theology or atheology, as in atheism, no atheology either, in the 12-step way, it fits into any and all cultural systems, offering what is called in step 12 a spiritual awakening. An awakening. A new clarity, a new understanding. Gorbachev called such an awakening perestroika, which he hoped would lead to an opening that he called glasnost. In other words, permeability, openness, permeability. To awaken and be permeable to each other again. There's so much talk about living in love and all of that. It becomes hackneyed, it becomes trite. But when we think of it as awakening and permeability, we jump past all the different cultural understandings of it into a unitive understanding of it. And Gorbachev was there. So what did they do? They voted him out and put in an active drunk named Yeltsin, a blowhard, a loudmouth, a narcissist. Gorbachev had the key. By opening, I mean intercultural permeability. It's the exact opposite of Putinism. I can see no other light at the end of this tunnel other than the oncoming light of the locomotive called echo disaster. How about you? What are you seeing when you really think about this stuff? What are you seeing? We all have our dreams, you know, we want this career, and we want this marriage, and we want these children, and we want this house, and we want this, this, and this, and this, and we buy, and we buy, and we buy, and they keep shoving it down our throats. And as I said, at the end of all the buy is bye-bye. We need to understand experientially, not theologically, not philosophically. We need to understand experientially within our own visible and invisible selves that dwell within the visible. We need to feel it. And we need to feel the pre-existing living mind of the sacred, because in the end, that is the best definition I've ever heard of all our names for God. We are the existent life on earth now. It's really, really what Eckhart Tolle was talking about in The Power of Now. We are the life community now. And we have to understand that in our subconscious, we are the entire biosphere now. It's like sawing the legs off your own table and not expecting to fall over. We are the native peoples and the wisdom of China and of India and of Israel and the sacred text of the U.S. Constitution. We have before us life and death. Can we choose life? I mean, are we even capable now of choosing life, our own and the life of others and other species? Will we follow bullies and liars to a collective grave? The choice is mine, and yes, the choice is also yours. The next time we meet, it will be in Chapter 9, which is Foundation 9. And we'll take a deeper and deeper and deeper look at culture, at what fundamentalism is, what all of that is, as we move toward what I hope to be the third covenant, the awakening, and the permeability of the human. Until then, bless you. We are the existent life on earth now.